My hand was still on the doorknob when I saw him. The old man from the coffee shop was sitting in the chair across from my branch manager's desk, except he wasn't wearing the windbreaker and the soft brown cardigan I remembered. He had on a navy suit pressed with a laminated badge from our parent company clipped to his breast pocket, and he was looking at me with the exact same expression he'd had 3 weeks earlier while he patted down his jacket, searching for a card that wouldn't go through. Patient, a little amused, like he'd been expecting me and had all the time in the world. I just stood there. I couldn't make my feet move. My manager looked up and said, "Come in and shut the door, Quinn." And I did. But I don't really remember doing it. I remember sitting down in the second chair and putting my hands flat on my own knees because they'd started shaking and I didn't want anyone to see. Let me back up. I was a year and a half into my job as a loan officer at a small community bank, the kind with one downtown branch and a couple of drive-through windows and a vault that hadn't been used to hold anything important since the 90s. It was the first real job I'd had after a string of part-time things and a degree that took me 6 years to finish because I kept having to drop down to part-time enrollment to make rent. I was 27. I had been broke for so long that having a salary and dental insurance still felt like a clerical error somebody was going to catch eventually. The bank was the kind of place where everybody knew everybody, and that cut both ways. On a good day, it felt like a family. On a bad day, it felt like a family too, the kind you can't get away from. My desk faced the lobby, and I spent my mornings smelling burnt coffee from the lobby cart and the lemons stuff the cleaning crew used on the marble, and I learned the rhythm of the place fast. The retirees who came in Tuesday mornings to move money around in person because they didn't trust the app, the contractors who needed something notarized, the young couples who sat across from me with that particular nervous brightness, asking what they'd have to do to qualify for their first house. I liked the work. What I didn't like, what I dreaded most mornings, was my supervisor. He'd been at the bank for 30-some years, and he ran the lending side, which meant he ran me. He was good at the job, I'll give him that. He could look at a file for 90 seconds and find the one thing you'd missed, the income that didn't reconcile, the address that didn't match the documentation, the debt-to-income ratio you'd rounded in the wrong direction. The problem wasn't that he caught things. The problem was how he did it. He never raised his voice. That was the worst part, honestly. He'd call you over to his desk and lay the file out and say, very quietly in this measured way, "Walk me through your thinking here," and then he'd wait while you walked him through it, and then he'd let the silence sit for a beat too long before he said, "Did you think that was acceptable? Or did you just not think?" Not a question. He'd let the rest of the floor hear just enough to know you were getting taken apart, and then he'd hand the file back and turn to his monitor like you weren't standing there anymore. The Monday before the coffee shop, he did it to me, over a file I had actually done correctly. I'd flagged a self-employed borrower's income the right way, asked for 2 years of returns, built the whole thing out clean. He called me over and circled one line in red where I'd written approx, instead of spelling out approximately, and he said, "If you can't be bothered to be precise in your language, why would I trust you to be precise with somebody's money?" and handed it back without another word. I went home that night and rewrote the whole file even though there was nothing wrong with it. I read it 4 times. I lay in bed until 2 in the morning replaying the way he'd said, "Why would I trust you?" And by the time my alarm went off, I had that hollowed-out, sandpapered feeling you get when you haven't really slept and you already know the day is going to be long. So I was not in a generous mood the next morning. I want to be clear about that because I think it matters to how the rest of this went. I wasn't feeling expansive or kind. I wasn't thinking about anybody but myself. I just wanted a large coffee and something with enough sugar in it to get me through the morning without my hand shaking, and I wanted to drink it in the 10 minutes I had before I had to go be a competent professional adult who hadn't cried in her car the week before. The coffee shop was 2 doors down from the bank, the independent kind with chalkboard menus and a guy who took forever with the espresso machine, and at 6:45 it was mostly empty. There was one man ahead of me in line. He was older, maybe early 70s, with white hair cut close and the kind of upright posture that made you straighten up a little just looking at him. He had on a windbreaker and a cardigan and khakis that had been ironed at some point in their life. He'd ordered a small coffee and a blueberry muffin, and he was standing at the register going through his wallet with that slow, careful motion that turns into something painful to watch when it goes on a few seconds too long. The kid at the register, who couldn't have been more than 19, was being decent about it, but you could see the line forming behind the patients. "It's still declining, sir," he said. "You got another card, or?" The old man patted his jacket pocket. Then the other one. "I think I left my other one in the car," he said, and his voice was low and unhurried, the voice of a man who had spent a lot of his life being listened to, but the tips of his ears had gone red. That's the part that got me. The ears. He had this composed dignify of holding himself, and his ears had betrayed him completely. Gone bright red, the way mine do when I'm more embarrassed than I'm letting on. "I can hold the muffin and you can run grab it," the kid offered. The man looked down at the muffin on the counter for a second. Just a second. And then he started to nod and reach to push it back across. I don't know exactly why I did what I did next. I've thought about it a lot since, and I still don't have a clean answer. I was tired. I was broke adjacent. $6 wasn't nothing to me back then. $6 had a slot it was supposed to go in. But watching a man in his 70s turn red over a blueberry muffin at 6:45 in the morning just landed wrong in me, in a place I was too worn down to argue with. "I've got it," I said, and I handed the kid a 10 before either of them could say anything. The old man turned around. He looked at me the way people do when they're trying to decide whether they've been helped or pitied, because those are two very different things and people can feel the difference. "You don't need to do that," he said. "It's a muffin," I said. "Please, it's fine." He held my eyes for a moment, and then he nodded once, slow. "Thank you," he said. And it wasn't the automatic thank you give somebody who holds a door. It was deliberate. He said it like it was a thing he'd decided to mean. I got my coffee, told the kid to keep the change, and went to work and forgot about it. Or I meant to. The day got on top of me too fast for me to dwell. It was the kind of day that takes a year off your life. I had a closing fall apart because the seller's title came back with a lien nobody had caught, and an elderly customer who came to my desk convinced somebody had drained her account, when really she'd just forgotten she'd set up an automatic transfer to her grandson. And it took me 45 minutes and 3 printed statements to walk her through it gently, enough that she stopped crying. And in the middle of all of it, my supervisor stood over my shoulder during a phone call I was on with an underwriter, listening, and after I hung up, he said, "You let them lead that call. You should be leading that call," and walked off before I could say anything. My coworker found me in the break room a little after 11. She'd been at the bank a year longer than me, and she had this hard-won calm about our supervisor that I hadn't managed to grow yet. She set a coffee down next to me without saying anything, which was how I knew she'd either seen the phone call or heard about it. "Him?" she said. "Him," I said. She pulled out a chair. She told me that the month before he'd circled something on her file in red and handed it back without a word, and when she finally worked up the nerve to ask what was wrong with it, it turned out to be a number that was correct and he'd just misread it. He never apologized. He just took the file back, looked at it, and said fine, like she'd wasted his time. Her theory was that men like him had been trained the same way decades ago by somebody exactly like him, and that they genuinely believed it worked. That fear made you careful, and careful made you good, and so the cruelty was actually a kindness if you squinted. She didn't think he was a bad man. She thought he was a man who'd been broken in a specific shape a long time ago and was now passing the shape along, completely convinced he was doing everyone a favor. I appreciated the theory. I did not find it comforting. The weeks after that settled into a pattern. I came in early. I triple-checked everything. I started keeping a little spiral notebook in my desk drawer, not for work exactly, but for him, for the things he picked at, so I'd have the answer ready the next time. I read the lending manual on my lunch breaks like it was scripture. I came in on a Saturday once off the clock to chase down documentation on a file that had been bothering me, and I found a discrepancy that would have blown up at closing, and when I brought it to him on Monday, he looked at it for a second and gave me a single nod and said, "Good," and turned back to his screen. I told myself the nod was something. I wasn't sure I believed it. About 3 weeks after the morning at the coffee shop, I saw the old man again. I was coming back from lunch, and he was standing in our lobby by the cart, talking to our regional liaison, a woman I knew by face but not by name, who always seemed to be walking very fast in whatever direction I wasn't. He was in the windbreaker again, the same cardigan, and they were having a quiet, serious conversation, her with her hands folded in front of her, nodding in that way people nod when they're listening very carefully and a little nervously. He saw me before I could decide whether to walk past or not. He gave me a small smile and the same slow nod he'd given me over the muffin, like he had all the time in the world for it. I smiled back and kept walking, and I thought about it on and off for the rest of the afternoon, the way you think about a thing that doesn't quite fit the shape of the room around it. The next morning, my branch manager asked me to come into her office. She'd run the branch for 11 years. She was precise and demanding and fair in this almost old-fashioned way, and she didn't pull you aside unless something had happened, and in my experience what had happened was either very good or very bad, with almost no in-between. So my stomach was already in my shoes when I knocked. She told me to come in and shut the door, and that's when I saw him. In the navy suit, with the company badge. Same white hair, same posture, same steady look, except those two details had changed everything about who he was. "Have a seat, Quinn," my manager said. I sat. For a moment nobody said anything. Then the old man leaned forward slightly and said, "I believe we've met." His name was the kind of name that sounded like it belonged on a building. He told me he'd spent more than 30 years in banking, started as a teller in a town smaller than the one we were in, worked his way up through lending and operations and eventually into the executive side, and that for the last several years, since he'd technically retired, he'd been doing consulting work for the holding company that owned our branch and a few dozen others like it across the region. His job, the way he described it, was to go into a branch quietly and spend a few weeks measuring the distance between what a bank says it values and what it actually rewards. He had not announced himself when he arrived. That was on purpose. The holding company was deciding who to put in charge of a regional role that would oversee our branch and several others, and part of his assessment was figuring out which of the current managers and supervisors were building something healthy and which ones were just keeping the numbers up by scaring everyone underneath them. I sat there and took this in pieces because absorbing it all at once was not something my brain was prepared to do at 7:45 in the morning. "I want to be straight with you," he said, "because I think you've earned that." He had this way of talking where the words seemed chosen rather than performed. "I've spent the last few weeks here. I've sat in the lobby. I've stood in line at that coffee shop more mornings than I'd like to admit. I've watched how people in this branch treat the customers, and I've watched how they treat each other, which is usually more telling." "That morning at the coffee shop," I said. My voice came out steadier than I felt. "You left your card in the car on purpose." He looked at me for a beat. "I left my wallet in the car," he said. Whether the rest of it was on purpose is a more complicated question. Something moved at the corner of his eyes that might have been amusement. I'd stood in that line a dozen mornings. I was curious what the people behind me would do when something small went wrong for an old man they didn't know. Mostly they looked at their phones. My manager was watching me with an expression I couldn't read. Not cold, not warm. Professional in the specific way that means a person already knows everything and is just watching to see how you handle finding out. "I also watched your floor," the old man said, and his tone shifted, not harder but more deliberate. "I watched how your lending side gets run in the mornings." I sat in the lobby with a newspaper I wasn't reading and I listened. I didn't say anything. There was nothing to say that wouldn't have come out as either agreeing too fast or defending a man I didn't want to defend. "There are things that get handed down in this business," he said. so reliably that people stop asking whether they should keep doing them. The idea that being hard on people makes them careful, that a little fear sharpens you, that the way to build someone good is to make sure they feel, every single day, that they're one mistake away from being told they don't belong here. He reached over to the edge of my manager's desk and picked up a folder I hadn't noticed. There's a version of rigorous that builds excellent people, and there's a version that builds people who've just learned to be afraid and to pass that fear down to whoever comes after them. They are not the same thing, and the difference matters more in a place that handles people's and anywhere else. He opened the folder. It was full of notes, the dense, highlighted kind. You built a file 3 weeks ago, he said. A self-employed borrower. 2 years of returns, the income reconciled properly. It came back to you, marked up in red. My stomach turned over. I read the original, he said. It wasn't sloppy. It was thorough, it was correctly reasoned, and it showed exactly the kind of judgment we spend years trying to teach. It got marked up because you'd abbreviated a word on the third line in a way your supervisor wouldn't have. Not a number. A word. Stylistic. He closed the folder. You rewrote the whole thing. I know, because I saw both versions. The room was very quiet. I had lain awake until 2 in the morning over that file, over the word approx. I'm not here to settle a grievance, he said. That's not what this is. Your manager and I have been talking through a number of structural things about how this branch runs, and those conversations are going to keep going, whether you and I ever spoke or not. But I wanted to talk to you directly because I watched how you handled being treated that way, and I watched what you did with it. I thought about the notebook, the Saturday off the clock, the lunch breaks with the manual. You didn't shrink, he said, you got more careful, and there's a real difference between those two. I realized my hands were folded too tight in my lap. The coffee shop, I said, because it felt like it needed saying. I wasn't trying to. I wasn't thinking about anything when I did that. I just didn't want to watch somebody's muffin get taken away. He nodded. I know, he said. That's exactly why it told me something. If you'd done it because you thought somebody was watching, it wouldn't have meant a thing. My branch manager spoke for the first time since I'd sat down. We're not asking you to decide anything or do anything today, she said. He asked to speak with a few people in this branch as part of all this. You're one of them. I nodded. I'll say one more thing, the old man said, and he leaned forward a little, the way people do when they want to make sure the next part lands. The way you've been treated these last few weeks is not the standard we hold here, or the standard we intend to hold going forward. There are going to be changes to how this branch is supervised, and to certain arrangements specifically. Those decisions are already made. He paused. You didn't cause them. You don't have to carry them, but you should know they're coming, and you should know why. I walked out of that office at a few minutes after 8, stood in the hallway by the supply closet for a second, and then kept walking, because I had a customer coming in at 8:30 and a file I hadn't pulled yet. My coworker found me in the break room at the usual time. She set a coffee down next to me without being asked. I told her about it in pieces, the way you tell somebody about a car accident, not because you're being dramatic, but because the order of it still doesn't feel like it happened in the right sequence. When I finished, she just said, the muffin, I said. You bought a stranger a $6 muffin, she said. And he turned out to be the guy deciding who runs this whole region. That's an accurate summary. She was quiet for a second. Then she said, I want to be the kind of person that happens to. You would have bought the muffin, I said. I'd like to think so, she said. Honestly, I'm not sure I would have. I've been in that coffee shop every morning for a year, and I'm always looking at my phone. I thought about that. About how many mornings I'd been looking at my phone too, and what had actually been different about that particular Tuesday. And the honest answer is, I'm not sure anything was different. I wasn't kinder that day. I was the opposite of kind that day. I was raw and tired and not in the mood to be generous with a single human being. A man's ears turned red and it bothered me, and I happened to be too worn out to come up with the reason to look away. That was it. It wasn't some great virtue. Maybe that's the most honest version of how decency actually works. Not that we're better than our worst days, just that sometimes we're too exhausted to build the little excuse that would let us walk past. Things changed at the branch after that, but slowly and not in a movie way. My supervisor still ran his side of the floor the same careful, quiet, cutting way for a while. But I stood at his desk one morning a couple of weeks later while he picked apart a file, and I found that I was listening to the actual substance of what he said instead of bracing for the tone of it. There was a real error in the file that time, something I genuinely missed on a rental property's income. And instead of going hot in the face and apologizing 6 times, I just said, "You're right. I'll fix the calculation and have it corrected before lunch." And he looked at me for a second and nodded and turned back to his screen. And the strange thing was, I didn't feel small. I felt like a person doing a job. It felt different. I can't fully explain it except to say that once you find out the fear was never the thing making you good, the fear loses most of its grip on you. The changes came down in an email about 3 weeks later. Branch-wide, written in that careful corporate language that's designed to make everything sound like a routine update. But anyone paying attention could read between the lines. New review procedures on the lending side, a revised approach to how feedback got documented and delivered. A note that the regional oversight role was being filled and would be announced at the next all-branch meeting. And buried in the org chart language, the quiet fact that my supervisor was moving into a different position. Special projects, it said, which is the kind of phrase that means a lot of things at once. My coworker forwarded me the email with no message, just forwarded it. The old man's appointment was announced on a Wednesday. I was at my desk when the company-wide notice came through. There was a short bio, the small-town teller, the 30-plus years, the consulting work, and a photo, a little formal but unmistakable. The same steady look, the same posture that seemed deliberate even in a still picture. The supervisor who took over the lending side was a woman who'd come up from another branch, and she ran the floor like a conversation instead of a cross-examination. She said, "I don't know, let me look into that out loud, in front of everybody, without it costing her anything." She asked you not just what you'd decided on a file, but why. And then she actually waited for the answer. The mornings stopped feeling like something to survive. They started feeling like the job, which is to say hard and busy, and sometimes overwhelming but not frightening. There's a difference. And I hadn't understood how big a difference until I had both to compare. I kept the notebook, not because I needed it the way I had, but because the habit had turned out to be a good one on its own. Writing things down, staying with the questions instead of letting the things I didn't know pile up in the corners where they could embarrass me later. Those turned out to be decent instincts no matter where they came from, even if they came from a bad place. A couple of months on, the new supervisor put my name forward for a credit analysis training the company ran for people they were looking to move up. It was the first time anyone at that bank had pointed at me and said this one in a good way, where the whole floor could see. I drove home that evening and sat in my car in the apartment lot for a minute before I went in, except this time it wasn't because I couldn't make myself walk into a building. It was just because I wanted to sit with the feeling for a second before it became normal. There was one more thing. The week before that, I'd come in early and found the new girl we'd just hired, 23, fresh out of school, sitting in her car in the bank lot with the windows fogged up, very clearly not coming in. I knocked on her glass. I asked if she was okay. She said she was fine in the bright, brittle voice people use when they are not fine at all. I told her I'd sat in a parked car in that exact lot before more than once, unable to make myself go in, and that it was okay either way. She laughed, surprised, and then she came inside, and I walked her up to the lending floor and showed her where the good coffee was hidden and which copier actually worked. The small stuff that matters more than it should when you're new and everything feels impossible. Small things. But they add up in one direction or the other, they always do. On a slow Friday near the end of that fall, I ran into the old man at the coffee shop. He was at the same register where I'd first seen him, with a small coffee and a blueberry muffin, and this time he was paying with a card that went through fine. He saw me and nodded. Morning, he said, and he used my name, and it was the first time anyone at that bank had said it without it feeling like the front end of a test. I got my coffee and took it to a table by the window, and for a few minutes the place was quiet the way it gets early, half empty, the espresso machine hissing, the smell of coffee and warm sugar. I thought about what he'd said in that office, that I hadn't shrunk. I'm still not sure that was entirely true. I think there were mornings that fall when I did shrink by inches in the small daily ways that are hard to see from the inside, and I think the notebook was partly a record of that, a list of every single thing I was afraid of not knowing. But I also thought about the new girl in the fogged-up car and about walking her up to the floor, and I figured maybe that evened out somewhere. You find out who you are in the small moments, the ones where nobody's keeping score and the line is short, and the man in front of you is about to have his muffin taken away. You find out whether you're the kind of person who looks up or the kind who looks at their phone. I wasn't trying to find out anything that morning. I was just tired, and a man's ears turned red, and I happened not to look away. Turns out that was the whole answer.